Um, what can I say after a day like this? I am to say that I'm overwhelmed is to put it mildly. People have been so generous and so kind. There are so many people to thank that I can't begin to name them. But I still, I would exhaust my allotted time were I to truly acknowledge the debt I owe to so many here. But I have to at least single out Madeline Lenski once again, who organized everything. Always been organizing everything. And organized it also on Wednesday. She organized a statewide cerebral palsy meeting. You know, she helped bring Bernard, got his tickets. I mean, everything. And we were bracketed by some social events last night and tonight. And Ellen, my wife, Ellen Pollock, played a large role in helping those happen. And of course, as many of you know, it's so many people said here, my very presence at MSU is owed to Ellen Pollock. Right after Ellen, we received an offer of a tenured position in the English department. And as you've seen already, I said, MSU? Where's MSU? Okay. And I want to thank everybody today who gave us of your insights and wisdom on such a range of topics today, and all held together by one thing, our joint desire to improve the health of the population. In my valedictory talk I gave last May, which has been quoted on that little video, it's on our departmental website. I reminisced about the founding of our department and the fortuitous way it came about. Now, today I'll talk a bit about my academic career and attempt to draw some lessons that may be of use, I hope, to the younger generation of scientists. And I've titled this talk, 50 Years in Epidemiology, Some Lessons Learned. Now, by titling it 50 Years in Epidemiology, I'm circling in the year 1972 as the point of origin. 1972 was the year I graduated from medical school, and also the year my first contribution to science was published, an abstract in the annual meeting of the American Thoracic Society on the topic, an infectious disease topic, BCG vaccination against tuberculosis in the United States. The work was done during an elective in epidemiology with the great Frank Spicer, pulmonary disease epidemiologist at Harvard, an elective that changed my career. Focus changed my life. And that presentation, co-authored with Frank, was the very beginning. I took 4 lessons away from that experience. The first one was my discovery that a single-minded passion for a topic, which I then had for BCG vaccine, can be translated into a useful and sometimes rare store of knowledge. My many hours in the Countway Library, tracking down papers that had been cited by other papers, uncovering such gems from the 1930s, forgotten gems, as an alternate assignment trial of BCG vaccine in Algerian newborns with overall infant mortality as the outcome. A treatment control study with some 3,000 children conducted by Joseph Aronson and his wife Charlotte in Indian reservations in the Western Alaska. The story of that couple has yet to be written. I really want to see that written somewhere. I've begun to do a little research on it. From the 30s, these important sources of strong evidence favoring BCG use had been nearly entirely forgotten. And the US public health consensus was that BCG was not useful in preventing tuberculosis. I learned then that solitary scholarly work, digging into a topic and trying to find out everything you can about it, is one of the most rewarding things you can do in academia. And the knowledge you gather is yours alone. You own the product of that kind of work. And I think I learned this lesson in part from my wife, whom I could only with difficulty pry away from the Bennington College Library when I was desperately trying to interest her in a certain Dartmouth medical student. The second lesson, which I learned to my great surprise, was that the conventional wisdom in medicine is not always correct. That same year, 1972, I interviewed for internships in pediatrics. One interview was with Horace Hodes, chair of pediatrics at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, and one of the giants of pediatric infectious disease in the 20th century, right? Definitely. Noting that I had done some work on BCG vaccine, he pressed me on the topic, more than a little skeptically, reminding me that the US trials of BCG vaccine which were led, by the way, by George Comstock, later to become a famous Johns Hopkins epidemiologist, did not show effectiveness. I pointed out that the vaccine used in those trials was later found to be of weak potency, and the trials were conducted in populations in the US South and Puerto Rico, where early life infections with atypical mycobacteria were common, providing some partial immunity to tuberculosis. To my astonishment, he ended the conversation by saying, well, it looks like you know more about BCG than I do. All this from hanging around a library. What a lesson. But the third lesson was a negative one. Although I wrote up the paper for the course and even got a prize for it at graduation, I never published the findings. My excuse was that my internship began the month following the publication of that lonely abstract, and that 80-hour weeks and clinical preoccupations left me no time to produce a publishable paper. As the years dragged on, the topic receded into the distance. I would see Frank Spicer periodically, and he would smilingly say things like, Nigel, you owe me a paper. It's been, let's see, 20 years? The lesson here is finish the job. In my subsequent work, I tried hard not to repeat that early mistake. And the fourth lesson, which I will come back to later because it has resonated lately for me, is that randomized trials, especially when negative, have considerable potential to mislead. A more justifiable starting point for my academic career would be 1978, the year I obtained my first NIH grant. My first lesson from that experience is that ignorance really can be bliss. Had I known better, I would not have submitted an R01 application to NIH, not much more than a year after completing my clinical training, my MPH not yet in hand, no published papers, and just one abstract to my name on a topic unrelated to the application. But I didn't know any better, and hardly anyone told me what a fool I was to apply, even though that was undoubtedly true. I must credit the Australian physician epidemiologist Fiona Stanley for setting me on the path towards that first R01. Fiona, by the way, is the elder sister of our own Bryden Stanley, professor of veterinary medicine at MSU. Fiona had just completed a fellowship in London with the British epidemiologist Eva Olbermann, and in 1976-77 was doing a fellowship at NICHD. Eva was a close friend of my mentors Mervyn Susser and Zena Stein, about whom more later, and thus Fiona was invited to give a talk in the epidemiology division at Columbia. I listened with rapt attention to the research he had just done on the then very new technology of newborn intensive care in a part of London. She showed, among other things, that mortality was higher for small babies born at night in hospitals without newborn intensive care, but no such variation was seen in better equipped hospitals. I wondered then whether we could examine the effectiveness of newborn intensive care in the entire population of births of New York City. I drafted a version of the study for a course in research proposal development at the Columbia School of Public Health in the spring of 1977. The teaching assistant gave my proposal a grade of C+. And then a colleague told me that someone had tried to study the effects of newborn intensive care on mortality in New York City. Hadn't found anything, and my goal was impossible. Now, all this negativity troubled me. After all, I was just a lowly assistant clinical professor. That's the lowest rung on the hierarchy, for those of you who don't know, clinical professor, doing general pediatrics at Jacobi Hospital in the Bronx. I wasn't even a neonatologist. Part of that negativity was a skepticism I've encountered often since about the value of vital data. We plan to obtain all of our outcome information from linked birth and death certificates. Not only are these forms of data collected on virtually everyone, they usually have a constrained set of variables that are checked carefully by state agencies for consistency and for adherence to guidelines. Electronic medical records, I'm afraid to say, are much less reliable and valid. But on the other hand, Mervyn Susser, for whom I always had enormous respect, was enthusiastic about the idea. And I had further support from two stellar neonatologists at Einstein, Larry Gardner and Kwong Soon Lee. Larry Gardner, by the way, appeared in one of the slides that John Tyson showed earlier today. I wrote my draft of the application by hand in script on a yellow legal pad, but I had a problem. I didn't know anyone who could type it up. in the format required by NIH. Those were the days, my friends. Sheepishly, I approached the secretary of the director of General Internal Medicine at Jacobi Hospital, someone not even in my department, who told me that since she was not that busy that week, she was willing to type up my grant application, which I sent to NIH in January of 1978. The application was sent from Einstein, but I had relocated to Columbia between submission and review. I don't know if anybody could have been more stunned than I was when the pink sheets arrived. They were indeed pink in those days, with a very good score and comments along the lines of, well, he's young and inexperienced, but he has some good ideas and he's working with good people. Those were the days. So the second lesson here is that it's important to give new ideas and new and untried scholars a chance. Naysayers abound and should be ignored unless they provide concrete suggestions for improvement. Choose carefully who you listen to. Many a good idea has been strangled in the cradle. Treat all new ideas as infants. They cannot yet walk. Don't expect them to run. And we did show that infants under 5 pounds at birth, born in hospitals with newborn intensive care units in New York City, had mortality rates a third lower than infants in other hospitals, accounting for all relevant confounders. As my career developed, I learned other lessons. The first lesson is the primacy of the idea. All fields seem to divide themselves to some extent into theoretical and the practical, or as in physics, as my friend Chip will tell you, the theoretical and the experimental. In epidemiology, I think the dividing line puts hypothesis formulation and study design on one side and execution and analysis on the other. Of course, we need both. But I think that in recent years, there's been a tilt towards execution and analysis shown most clearly in the emphasis on what is considered important in judging randomized trials, which seems to leave aside such questions as to whether the hypothesis is sensible, the dosage correct in amount and timing, whether the underlying population is appropriate, in favor of statistical nuances. And another example is our current fascination with artificial intelligence and data mining, with the implication sometimes that hypothesis formulation is merely an expression of the investigator's biases, or the view that with a large enough sample size, we can solve any problem. In the lamented National Children's Study, all hypotheses were abandoned in favor of calling the study an exercise in data collection. That actually happened. Its inevitable failure was preordained at that moment. Study design based on well thought out hypotheses is at the core of successful epidemiology. Designing studies is also one of the great joys of our field. How does one take a scientific idea and create an array of free living individuals in the field with or without disease and use that array of people and information to draw a conclusion that will advance public health? That is always the challenge. And I'd like to underline one of the most important study design questions. Who does our study design leave out? Some of you know the famous example of the mathematician Abraham Wald's recommendation to the military in World War II as to where airplanes needed reinforcing. Shown the locations of damage to planes that returned to base, he surprised the military by saying that the reinforcement should be made in the parts of the planes that were not hit. Why? Because, he reasoned, planes hit in those parts were the ones that did not return to base. In our studies too, we are sometimes misled because we don't think enough about who's not in our study. And I have to say, an aside, Abraham Walds grew up in a town called Kolozsvár in Hungary, now Cluj in Romania, where my father also lived for a few years of his childhood. So there's a connection there. And also his son, Robert Wald, who's a well-known physicist at Princeton, was in my class at Columbia and is an old buddy. So I have a special attachment to that particular piece of statistical reasoning. It is indeed fortunate for me that so many of the people who work with me collaboratively to design studies are here either in person or on Zoom or in our collective memories. Mervyn Susser and Zena Stein are no longer with us, alas, though they lived to great ages, but I'm so happy that their son, Ezra Susser, and their nephew, Aryeh Stein, are with us. This remarkable couple helped in every part of my early study designs, as did John Kiley, and who co-designed the next study, also funded by NIH, that showed that fetal deaths in labor were fewer in hospitals that had higher levels of intensive perinatal care. Indeed, this new technology, or perhaps we should say a new attention to the perinatal period by medicine, was really lowering mortality. So powerful an influence was it that the decade with the sharpest decline in neonatal mortality in the US in the 20th century was the 1970s, when newborn intensive care got underway. The improvement in mortality led us to think about the disabilities that are unfortunately common in premature infants and to design new studies that would investigate the question. In a series of papers with Mervyn, Zena, and John Kiley, we predicted that this dramatically better survival would inevitably translate into higher numbers of handicapped children, a conclusion resisted then by some neonatologists. That prediction did in fact come true, but it looks as though, for cerebral palsy at least, that the prevalence has started to decline, as Bernard has pointed out, in high-income countries in the 21st century. The new focus on disability produced a whole series of studies, beginning with the neonatal brain hemorrhage study conducted with Jennifer Pinto-Martin, who's spoken early today, which began with newborns and had at least 4 rounds of NIH-supported follow-up studies taking children into their 20s, each focusing on a different aspect of health and development. I'm happy to say that these studies helped to launch Jennifer's great career in autism epidemiology. And then I was fortunate to collaborate with Alan Levitin and Carl Kuban as we built first the Developmental Epidemiology Network, and then, joined by Olaf Dahman and Michael O'Shea, the Extremely Low Gestational Age Newborn Study, ELGAN, that's still in the field examining these babies who have been born 3 months early, who are now about 18. And then I came to Michigan, and I developed, along with Sarosh Saigal, John Tyson, and Madeline Lenski, a study comparing outcomes for low birth weight infants in 5 population-based international cohorts in the US, Canada, Germany, Holland, and Jamaica. Jack Lorenz was also involved and led a most important paper from that study showing that mortality rates for very small infants were higher in Holland, but disability rates were lower. And then circumstances moved us away from low birth weight newborns into the broader population of children as the National Children's Study, which we entered with great hopes, creating a consortium of MSU, the University of Michigan, Wayne State, Henry Ford, and our health department. I should say that Bob Sokol was absolutely central to those efforts. He was then at Wayne State, had been chair of OBGYN, and also had been dean of the medical school there. And our health department, to conduct the study, we began to recruit unselected pregnancies, moving our focus also into the prenatal period. As noted earlier, the National Children's Study collapsed and was replaced by the ECHO study, which we are currently in the middle of writing a renewal application for. In these efforts, Jean Curver was my essential colleague, serving first as a project director of the National Children's Study, and then as a co-investigator now as the contact co-principal investigator of the large ECHO study. And we are both bolstered by a superb group of young field operatives who were here earlier today but seem to have disappeared, led by Alexa Drew and Brianna Kornatowski, not to mention wonderful scientific collaborators throughout the state. And then came COVID. I knew Mike Joyner and Arturo Casadeval from our joint work, trying not very successfully so far to put a dent in the at times rabid enthusiasm for the Human Genome Project and its alleged benefits to mankind. That's when Arturo began to talk about the potential of convalescent plasma, a topic on which he has been writing for nearly 30 years to make a difference to COVID outcome. We created an organization nearly overnight that included hundreds of physicians, a website directed here by MSU, and a 7-person leadership team that initially studied the effects of convalescent plasma and then, convinced it had a role to play, began to advocate for its broader use. And this study returned me to a conclusion that was nearly 50 years old. Randomized trials may be at the top of our research design hierarchy, but they do not constitute the entirety of evidence, and they can go badly wrong. We're not informed by the best science, or perhaps, as suggested by John Tyson, but they're not supported by Bayesian approaches. Physicians who provided convalescent serum to their patients in the great age of passive antibody treatment in the 1890s and 1930s would have been surprised indeed to see trials of convalescent plasma in COVID-19 performed in hospitalized patients who had been on ventilators weeks after the onset of disease. Their mantra was, treat in the first 3 days of illness or forget about it. And they would have been shocked to see eminent medical authorities and institutions pay more attention to large, poorly conceptualized studies that did not show effectiveness than to smaller but more carefully designed studies, one of which Arturo showed you, one by David Sullivan at Hopkins and others, done earlier in the illness course that showed substantial effectiveness. This quick overview of a lifetime of research underlines what may be perhaps the most important lesson of all, the value of colleagues. It is conventional to refer to many activities as team sports, but as documented in my career, epidemiology is truly about teamwork. Successful epidemiology is achieved only by working together. And I include here colleagues who one does not work with directly, but who we see at intervals, at scientific meetings, at guest lectures, or on panels assembled for a special purpose, or just by reading their papers. I met Bernard Dan when Madeline and Alan Levitin and I, among others, were gathered to try to attach a solid definition to the ancient term cerebral palsy. We published that definition in 2005 and revised it slightly in 2007, and these two papers have been cited, according to Google, nearly 10,000 times. And I have not been in the same room with Alan Wilcox, even if that room was a coffee shop or a bar, where I did not learn something new and interesting. That so many of my colleagues are here in person or on Zoom gives me great joy. And then one learns from students who are too many to name. But there are so many here who were once in classes of mine. I began to make a list, and the list got longer and longer and longer. And I'm afraid I cannot credit all the wonderful students who are right here or on the Zoom who have been in classes of mine and who have shown by their own work and careers how much they have to teach and contribute to science and public health. And even the monk-like library work that I advocated a few minutes ago is not truly solitary because it puts you into conversation with people who lived and worked long ago, many of whom did remarkable science. So if I had to summarize what I have learned for the benefit of someone entering the field now, I would say this. 1, prepare yourself. Get lost in conversation with the scientists who preceded you. The library houses some of your best friends. And the farther you go back in time, the more interesting these friendships become. 2, do not fear a new idea, even if, perhaps especially if, it conflicts with conventional wisdom and is dismissed by individuals who have not really examined it closely. And always remember that it is ideas that drive data collection, not data collection that drives ideas. Seek out supportive mentors, not yes people, but genuinely critical people who, and also I should say here, where did I learn to do all that red ink? Mervyn. How many drafts did Mervyn make us do? Oh my God. If you hadn't done 15 drafts, you were nowhere. Not yes people, but genuinely critical people who know how to help shape a new idea to make it into a realistic study, workable in the field. Learn to distinguish naysaying from intelligent criticism. Try as much as possible to study representative samples, or at least samples of people that don't leave lots of people out. Vital data are epidemiologic gold mines. In making decisions, be they for clinical or public health purposes, use all available information. Randomized trials are great, but they do not constitute the entirety of evidence, and they can sometimes mislead. In choosing what studies to undertake, allow yourself to prioritize ventures that have real potential to lead to public health improvement. And the 7th thing, I think I forgot to number them, follow the lead of Mervyn and Zena in adhering to the truth of your findings, no matter the consequences. I was actually at a meeting at Einstein where a progressive physician, after hearing Zena's presentation on the Dutch lung, showed that starvation did not change IQ. He said, you should not publish these findings. They're bad. You should not, just keep them quiet. And Mervyn and Zena, who are the most progressive people I've ever met in my life, and upon political matters, did not pay attention. They said, the truth is the truth. Science is science. And lastly, and most importantly, as shown here today, collegiality and collaboration are the lifeblood of epidemiologic science. Do your best to work with good people and to meet people who share common interests. Attend lectures, go to meetings, initiate friendships, create teams. Do not hesitate to approach senior people with questions or conversation. And at the same time, do not hesitate to bring an eager young person who knows little or nothing into the field. And thanks to each and every one of you for doing me the great honor of participating in this memorable event. Thank you.